childhood joy, the family car. Barefoot days in summertime, we always dreamed that we could fly. Memories will never die, as long as we try to touch the past.
Nostalgia, a word for the feelings and sentiment a person has about specific times, places, even physical objects. The emotion is created by seeing an old car, toy, even a familiar face or faces that once touched your life. Hello everybody, I'm T. Patrick Silver, welcoming you to another edition of To Touch the Past. Today we're going to the Civil War and Antique Locomotive Museum. You'll find out what makes a locomotive work and what made the Civil War tick. Talk to you later on To Touch the Past.
Okay, my name is Harper Harris, coming to you from the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History. What we have in our locomotive is the Locomotive the General, which is the most famous locomotive in the world. It was involved in an escapade that happened during the Civil War called the Great Locomotive Chase. It'd be hard-pressed to write a story as good as the Great Locomotive Chase. On April the 12th, 1862, a band of Union soldiers worked their way over 200 miles behind the enemy lines to Marietta, Georgia, and there they boarded a train going north, and their intentions were to burn the bridges and tear up the tracks behind them. Everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong, and they caught these guys. Several of them were hanged, and the leader was hanged. Several of them were paroled or exchanged. And these boys that lived through this were the very first people to receive the Medal of Honor, our military's highest medal that they give. We'd love to have you come out and see our museum, and we've got a lot to see here. We have a 24-minute movie on the Great Locomotive Chase. We also have a factory built on the lines of the Glover Locomotive Factory in Marietta, Georgia. Mr. Glover never threw away anything, and we have quite a bit of his stuff here. So we'd be glad to have you. Bring the grandkids, and we're looking forward to seeing you. Kennesaw, Georgia had a very big role in the Civil War. Kennesaw at that time was called Big Shanty. We were the first stop on the Great Locomotive Chase. This is where the locomotive was actually stolen. While the crew went in to eat breakfast, Fuller, Captain Fuller, the conductor, Jeff Kane, the engineer, and Anthony Murphy, the railroad foreman, all went in, and the crew went in to eat breakfast. While they were in there, the Yankees stole the train. Right across the street from the depot was Camp McDonald, a training camp for the Confederates. There were over 3,000 Confederates watching them steal the locomotive. Wasn't a thing they could do but watch them drive off with it. This area later on after the war was Camp McDonald, went on for a few months after that. General Sherman, his command used this as a garrison. He garrisoned Kennesaw with a cavalry group. He also used it to drop off all his wagons, supply trains in Kennesaw. Right down the road, the trench line of Kennesaw Mountain, the Battle of Big Shanty. There was actually two battles here, one early in the war, one late in the war. Toward Kennesaw Mountain, the line was very close to here, which became a very hard-fought battle, one of Sherman's defeats. So Kennesaw, as you see, had a lot to do with the Civil War. The weapons you see behind me are Whitworth rifles. They were made in England. They were not a weapon for a common man. They were made for the rich. They were used as target weapons to be shot in competition against each other. When the war broke out, they were used to kill a man from as far as a mile away. These guns were very expensive, so the Confederates could only afford a very few of them. They know that Robert E. Lee's army had a few of them, but they don't know how many he had. They do know the army down here had at least 12 of them, because 12 were snuck through the Yankee blockade by the ships into Georgia ports. In the winter of 1864, the Confederates had a target shoot in Dalton, Georgia, to see who was the best shot of the whole Confederate army. Around 50,000 men participated in this shoot. The 12 best shots were given these rifles. The men worked in teams of twos, one at a spot as a spotter, the other as a shooter. They were excused from all the other details of being a soldier. They would go out in the field in the morning. They may not take but one shot a day. In the Spotsylvania campaign in Virginia, General Sedgwick come riding up. A lot of the men were hunkered down. He asked them what the problem was, and they said, General Sedgwick, somebody's shooting at us from way, way off. He said, boys, they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. About that time, he was hit right in the head, killed instantly by a Whitworth bullet. As a young man, I used to do a lot of relic hunting around this area with metal detectors, and we used to find these bullets, but they're about all gone now. The exhibit you see here is a pistol and revolver exhibit. If you'll notice what these fellas behind this, in this photo or in this painting, they have pistols. Cavalry loved pistols because you have to have one hand to control your animal with, and they had one hand that they could shoot a pistol with. When you shoot a rifle, you have to be able to steady that rifle with both hands, but with a pistol, you can use just one hand. By the time the Civil War rolled around, there were a lot of revolvers available. Revolvers shot from many times as 5 to 9 times. The gun you see on the bottom is a LeMat revolver. It shoots 9 shots, and the barrel in the middle is a shotgun. So if somebody come at you with that, they really meant business. Jeb Stuart, the famous Confederate cavalry leader, carried 2 of these. They also had double action guns, which were very expensive during the American Civil War. Double action means that you could pull the trigger, the gun would automatically cock itself and shoot. Most guns of that day were single action, where you had to cock the trigger, or cock the hammer, and pull the trigger. The 2 guns you see here are called horse pistols. They were mounted on 2 holsters on the pommel of the saddle of a horse, and they were carried on the saddle, and that's why they were called horse pistols. The guns you see here in this case are pretty much the standard weapons of both North and South. When the war broke out, there were a lot of old smoothbore weapons in the arsenal. Smoothbore weapons shot a 69 caliber ball, a round ball, with 3 small balls called bucks. They called this bucket ball. This was very deadly at the range of about 50 yards. Rifled muskets had come out before the Mexican War. And the best way for me to describe a rifle to you is if I was to stand here and throw a football and stand here and throw a basketball, which one would go further? The football. The football spins. It will go 3 times as far as a basketball. The rifles, they did not have enough of them to go around when the war broke out. They imported a lot of guns from Europe. Europe had quite a few wars before the American Civil War. There was a lot of equipment and guns there. They bought guns from France. They bought guns from Belgium, from Prussia, from Sweden, and by far they bought more guns from England than anybody. This gun you see in the case with the chain on it is an English Enfield rifle. England sold guns to the United States government, and they sold guns to the Confederate government. They were the second most popular gun of the Civil War. The guns you see in this case are a good example of the guns that were used on both sides of the Civil War. Various instruments of the American Civil War. We have bugles, drums, and fifes. The drum was a very important instrument in the American Civil War because that's how they commanded the armies. Officer would tell the drummer boy the commands he wanted to give. The drummer boy would play the drum, the command on the drum. The soldier would hear the command and do what the officer wanted him to do. Same way with the bugle. The bugle would play the command that he wanted, and the army would hear it. Very, very important to the army. If a young fellow would join the army and agree to go to school to be a musician, a lot of times they would let him join up at a younger age. And it was found that there were boys as young as 9 years old joining the Confederate and the Yankee armies, being drummer boys and musicians. If you'll notice the banjo during the Civil War was a very popular instrument. before the Civil War by a fellow by the name of Joel Sweeney from Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, had learned to play the banjar, gourd banjo from the slaves on his father's plantation. He ended up joining a circus, him and his brother. His brother played the fiddle. Sweeney gave lessons on the banjo to other people. He started one of the first minstrel shows in America. Minstrel shows were very popular before the American Civil War. And when you talk about a minstrel show, you think that they would be more popular in the South. But the minstrel shows were actually far more popular in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia than they were anywhere. When the Civil War broke out, all these minstrel musicians were drafted into the Army. The Army is a very boring place. Fighting is just part of it. So these boys started minstrel shows to pass the time away. What that did was that made the banjo available, the sounds of the banjo, to these young boys that had never been around any music at all. These young farmers that had never been but maybe 30 miles from home, they were introduced to this instrument, the banjo. After the Civil War, the banjo was a very, very popular instrument because of that. In this case, the young fellow was from North Carolina, 21 years old, died at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, stabbed in the back with a bayonet. As you can see, it's a pretty simple uniform. Most of the uniforms that survived the American Civil War were officer uniforms. The reason being is when the war was over, the officer came home, took his uniform, put it in a trunk, put it in the bottom of a drawer. The young enlisted man came home. Being a farmer, he had nothing but the shirt on his back. These uniforms were worn until they just disintegrated into nothing. And the uniforms that are in the museum now, a lot of them were uniforms that young men were killed in and were actually sent home from battle. We're fortunate here to have 7 Confederate uniforms. 3 of them, the boys were killed in. This is a Zouave uniform. It came from the Smithsonian Institute. Zouave was a French elite unit in the 19th century. The French being the elite army in the 19th century. Everybody wanted to be like the French. Confederates had a group of Zouaves, and so did the United States have a group of Zouave units. Before the Civil War, you had militia units, both North and South, that were kind of like the reserve units of today. They were always scared of Indian uprisings or slave uprisings in the South, and these militia units were sometimes considered social clubs. They were based on the military way of doing things. They had weapons, they would drill, they had different uniforms, and they estimated that by the time the Civil War rolled around, there were probably over 150 different types of uniforms when the American Civil War started. The uniform you see here came from the Smithsonian Institute, and as many things in our museum did. Even though the Great Locomotive Chase was not successful, it was successful in the sense that the Confederates were so shook up that the Yankees had come 200 miles behind the lines and stole the locomotive that they had to post guards on the bridges and the water towers to protect from that happening again. Our exhibit here, this is Lucius, and Lucius tells the young patrons of the museum how boring it is to be on guard duty guarding these railroad bridges. The American Civil War is probably one of the last wars that they actually used swords to fight with. One of the most frightening things to a young infantry soldier was to see a cavalryman come over the hill with a drawn saber riding down on him as fast as he could ride. Sabers were curved for a reason. The reason that it's easier to pull out on a curve than it is a straight sword. Also, if a cavalryman runs through a man, pulls it out easier if it's curved. The infantry soldiers, the officers carried a short, straight sword. They would put their hat on the end of the sword to rally the troops with. The naval cutlasses had an edge on both sides, on the top and the bottom, and that's called a two-edged sword. and it was copied after the Roman swords of the day. In the years of the army, they used a little bit of different weapon than the infantry soldier. They used shorter rifles that were connected to a belt around their waist. If they dropped the rifle, if they had to shoot and drop it, they didn't have to go back and get it. The sabers were connected to their hand with a piece of leather for the same reason. Everything had a purpose in the cavalry. Each part had a purpose because of the weight on a horse. They wore boots. They carried a lot of pistols to be able to fight close up. Me was made for a gentleman from South Carolina. The story goes is that his wife told him not to bring it back with any holes in it. Well, he kept that promise because it was sent home to him from the Battle of Chickamauga, where he received a mortal head wound. If you'll notice the blood stain on the collar, he was hit in the head. His brother sent this uniform back to his wife. It is made out of mattress ticking, which back then is what they used to stuff mattresses and pillowcases with. His wife probably made this uniform with loving care for him to fight in the war with. Like many boys, he didn't come back home. It's a very good example of homemade uniform. The uniform was found in a trunk in Marietta, Georgia. The vest, coat, pants, shoes, and cappy all belonged to the same fella who was a cadet at the Georgia Military Institute in Marietta. How that ties in with our museum is that across the street from the Lacey Hotel, where the Locomotive the General was stolen, was Camp McDonald's, the training camp for the Confederates. These young cadets from the Georgia Military Institute were used as officers to train these boys how to fight and how to shoot their muskets. This is a very good example of a jean wool material coat and pants and vest. Owned this uniform. Lived in Columbus, Georgia. He was offered a commission in the Alabama Volunteer Corps, which he became a lieutenant in. This uniform, hat, shoes, pants, saber, and pistol all came out of one family in Columbus, Georgia. The buttons on this uniform say AVC, which stands for Alabama Volunteer Corps. This is a very unusual find to find a uniform in this good a condition. Mr. George Ray, who recently passed away about 6 months ago, was the owner of these uniforms in this museum. One of his favorite pieces that he had was this hat that you see on this uniform here. The story goes is that Mr. Ray bought this hat from a family in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This hat had been in the family since the Civil War and had came from an area of the Gettysburg battlefield called the Wheat Field. A lot of Georgia troops had passed through this field and fought and died, and this hat was found by a young boy as he walked through a field. He was curious about the eagle on the top and the emblem on the hat, and that's why he brought it home. Mr. Ray bought it from the family in the 1950s, and it was one of his favorite pieces. There's an overcoat, which is very rare to find because the Confederates wore these overcoats after the war till they went to nothing. This coat has Georgia State Seal buttons on it with a Georgia State Seal hat. The rifle is a Cook and Brother rifle made in Athens, Georgia. It was a copy of a 2-band infield rifle and was used quite often by the Confederate troops. It has a sword bayonet on it, and a lot of the troops liked this rifle. In the 1840s, gold was discovered in Dahlonega, Georgia. The Cherokee Indian tribe, which populated this part of Georgia, was taken up, moving to Oklahoma, and that opened this land up, the land opportunities. A fellow by the name of John Hayward Glover came here from South Carolina, a wealthy rice plantation owner. He came here to take advantage of those land opportunities. Him and two other gentlemen settled the town of Marietta, Georgia. John Hayward Glover owned several different businesses in Marietta. He owned the largest tannery in the state of Georgia. He tanned leather. In the 19th century, that was a very important industry. He became the first mayor of Marietta. He died in 1859 before the American Civil War started. He had three boys that joined the Confederate Army. They actually fought the whole war under Robert E. Lee in the cavalry. When the war was over, they came home and the tannery had been burnt to the ground. They decided to try to start another tannery, which was not very successful. Sons ended up going to school in Pennsylvania, became an engineer. He came back home and talked his father and his uncle into opening.
Anytime you're ready, go ahead.
Came home, he talked his uncle and his father into buying a foundry that was already established in Marietta called the Phoenix Foundry. One of the first things that they tried to build was log skidders. The lumber industry was booming after the Civil War, and Mr. Glover became very successful in selling these steam-driven engines that pulled logs out of the woods. Somebody came to Mr. Glover with a small locomotive and asked him to work on it. Mr. Glover took the engine apart and said, "Boys, we can build these things." The first engine they built was in 1898. They decided to build a new plant, and in 1904 they built a brand new factory to build locomotives with. From 1904 to 1930s, the Glover family built over 200 locomotives. Their locomotives went to 12 countries and 12 different states all over the United States. They were very successful in this business. In the 1930s, they closed the locomotive factory and decided to get into the pipe business. They moved the foundry to Cordele, Georgia. In Cordele, they would cast the parts, ship them to Marietta to the old locomotive factory, grind them, drill holes in them, paint them, and ship them out from Marietta to the businesses that had bought them. This business ran until 1995, making it one of the oldest family-owned businesses in America. When Mr. Glover sold out to the city of Marietta, they decided to try to build a museum to the Glover factory. Well, Mr. Glover never threw away anything, and the old factory was just a treasure trove of stuff in the casting industry and the locomotive factories. In the very beginning of building this museum, we were contacted by a gentleman from Alabama. He said his grandfather had invented the Smith valve gear, which the Glovers had used on their locomotives. After doing some research, we found out that we actually had some of the blueprints of the Smith valve gear in our archives. This gentleman said he had a locomotive pattern that his grandfather had built to acquire a patent for this valve gear. We were asked if we would be interested in this, and it became a part of our collection in our museum. After the locomotive chase, the general went into service for the Confederate Army. At the very end of the war, she was stuck in Atlanta with 4 of the locomotives and 82 boxes of ammunition. Confederate General Hood ordered her destroyed. These 3 engines were destroyed along with the 82 boxcars of ammunition, and the engine was blown just about completely apart. After the Civil War, the engines that the federal government had captured were given back to the southern states. The state of Georgia, owning the general, sent it to Nashville, where it was completely rebuilt, put into service as a coal burner. She ran until 1887, when they decided to retire her. A fellow by the name of Clark, who was a doctor, saw her on the railhead fixing to be scrapped, and he talked an official in the NC in St. L into completely rebuilding her. They ran her to several World's Fairs, cotton expos, where she became a very popular engine. This is about the time the veteran organizations were popping up all around the country, and they used the General as a place to have their reunions. The Raiders did. In 1898, she was put in the Union Station at Chattanooga, where she sat from till 1961, when L&N took her out, sent her to Louisville, and completely rebuilt her, and ran her for the Civil War Centennial, where she became a very popular exhibit for the American Civil War Centennial in the 1960s. In 1967, she was given to the state of Georgia. Chattanooga felt that like the engine belonged to them, and they sued L&N Railroad for the rights to the Locomotive de General. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld a lower court ruling that it belonged to L&N and they could give it to who they wanted to. The engine was given to the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia, in turn, gave it to the city of Kennesaw, where it sits today in this building.
Hello. Anyway, we saw a lot of the Civil War relics. We saw a lot of the locomotive relics. Anyway, it's coming up next week on To Touch the Past. Talk to you later. Bye.